name is Yuki Lee Bender, and I'm bringing you a deck tech for the Iyslander deck that I'm planning to take to 2022 Canadian Nationals. It's right now Thursday evening as of the time of recording, and I'll be going to Nationals. I'll be traveling tomorrow and then playing on the Saturday. So the deck is more or less finalized. There's still room for maybe a couple of changes, but this is pretty much the list that I'm going to be playing, and I'm excited to be sharing it with you. Shout out to LSS for giving me the opportunity to do this, and shout out to Nia Tran and Victor, who have kind of worked on this deck with me and helped me build this Iyslander deck. All right, without further ado, let's jump right into things. Okay, so this is a CC Iyslander deck that is playing Waning Moon to deal a large amount of damage on our opponent's turn after playing a blue. Just a very efficient weapon. We of course have the Wizard Boots Stormstriders, just very powerful. Unlike Kano, this isn't really a win condition so much as a big tempo play to kind of swing the game into our favor. We have then our Arcane Barrier sideboard, so Alluvian, Constellas, and Metacarpus nodes for matchups where we need Arcane Barrier. This one is mostly for the Viserai and Wizard matchups where there's lots of consistent arcane damage, and then Metacarpus can be useful for some matchups like Dromai where we just need a little bit more poke. Our other armor is Final Spring Tunic, which is played in the majority of matchups, just a really solid piece of equipment, and Ironhide Gauntlets for the block. And then I'm actually missing one piece of equipment, which is the Coronet Peak. This is really essential, both as a 2-block and as a way to allow us to pitch and often keep around Channel Lake Frigid and disrupt our opponent. So right now my Coronet Peak is missing, but it's another key piece of equipment for the deck. Alright, so first off, let's talk about the combo pieces for this deck. Iyslander is sort of a tempo control combo deck, gets to do a little bit of all of them. It kind of reminds me of a hybrid between Prism and Lexi, where you get to build up a board state, but also control the pace of the game by disrupting your opponent and providing these kind of like ice on hits and disruptive effects. So here I have sort of the key different combo pieces that play different roles in different matchups. We have Amulet of Ice and Insidious Chill as permanents that stay on the board and allow us to make our opponent discard or pay 2 resources. There's a third amulet that comes in for some matchups where we lean into that plan more, but generally these are key cards in just about every matchup, regardless of whether it's control or whether it's aggressive decks. Against control, we're looking to get multiple of these and take most of our opponent's hand. Usually the key number is 4 discard effects to force our opponent to pay 8 resources, which takes most if not all of their hand, and then allows us to play something like an Ice Eternal, creating a whole bunch of Frostbites and dealing a whole bunch of damage with the Frost Hexes in play. So that's kind of the control into like the slower Guardian decks. We'll set up a bunch of Frost Hexes. Into some of the mid-range decks like Dash and Dromai, we might only have time to set up maybe 1 or 2 Frost Hexes. And against the aggro decks, we mostly just try to set up this disruption and chip them out and don't rely so much on the Frost Hexes, although they can speed up our clock quite significantly. The next set of cards I want to talk about here are the damage spells that are from the core, specifically the red and yellow damage spells. So we have Aether Hail as just an efficient spell, and then the full suite of Aether Ice Veins. The disruption on this is very powerful, and the fuse is a really nice way to trigger our Insidious Chills as well as our Amulets of Ice, and often chaining these together against aggressive strategies can be really potent. And into other like kind of mid-range decks, this is a great way to take tempo and allow us to find time to set up our Frost Hexes and our other combo pieces. So this is kind of like the core way of how we deal damage. And then we do have a few more options for dealing damage in the sideboard that we'll look at when we get there, but these ones we play all of the time because they're just fantastic and really solid. Aether Hail is just sort of in here as a really efficient spell. It represents 6 damage off of blue with the Waning Moon, or you can play it for 4 off the Tunic, and that kind of flexibility and efficiency is just really, really good in Iyslander, who sometimes struggles to be as efficient with their cards as some of the other decks or some of the other heroes in the format. So finally, here's a complete layout of all 34 blues that are in the core deck. Some of these we've already talked about, so we have our permanents that help us discard, we have our combo pieces and our Aether Ice Veins, and then rounding out the rest of our blues, we have all of the blue wizard ice spells that deal damage, so Frostings, Aether Hail, and Ice Bolt. They're all just block 3s that do efficient damage and give a Frostbite. They're fantastic cards in the deck and can help us deal damage on our opponent's turn. In addition to this, we have some other ice blues in the form of Winter's Bite and Cold Snap. Winter's Bite, nice disruptive card, and Cold Snap, allows us to do a mix of disruption as well as damage, because often we can pitch a blue for this and Waning Moon, and then we get the card draw to replace itself. So it often lets us do that Waning Moon quite aggressively on our opponent's turn, and is sort of like a combination disruption and offensive card all in one. Channel Lake Frigid is a card that is very good pedigree, and for very good reason. It's fantastic and every ice deck plays it, but it might be at its best in Iyslander because you get to play it on your opponent's turn, giving them a frostbite at instant speed, and then you can very easily kind of keep it around on your turn by perhaps by pitching one of your ice blues, such as a Frosting, to Coronet Peak, and then keeping the flow counter on it. It's also fairly easy to keep 2 flow counters on it, either by playing something and then pitching another card, or you can even Coronet Peak yourself sometimes to pitch 2 ice cards and keep that Channel Lake around for a 3rd turn. So Channel Lake just really, really good, especially in Iyslander. Finally, we just have Brain Freeze, another way to fuse and another way to trigger our discards, and also a disruptive piece against the aggro decks. So these blues stay in against all of the decks and really kind of allow us to do a variety of things, including setup as well as poke as well as disrupt. So now we're going to be going over the sideboard. You can see it's quite a big sideboard. The deck has 43 cards in the core, and then a whole bunch of different sideboard cards that we can use to customize our game plan into different decks and kind of customize both which reds as well as which blues that we're going to be playing, and we can shift game plans quite dramatically with Iyslander. So first of all, we have our red spells. And these red spells are used to help poke and force through damage. We're usually playing at least some of them and sometimes all of them. Ice Bolt just as an efficient spell, and then Freezing Point can really add up because it sees Frost Afflictions, which counts Frost Hex, as well as any Frost Bites that you might have. So you can sometimes Freezing Point for 6, 7, 8, even 9 damage, and that's really quite a powerful thing to do. It also triggers our discard effects. Next, to help us deal damage, we have all of our attacks. Command and Conquer, quite a staple, really good disruptive card, and a 6-power popper for Dromai, a Race Face, a popper, and a good card against the Viserai matchup. And then Enlightened Strike is a little bit of an unconventional pick. This card just has raw efficiency, 7 damage off 2 cards, or 5 damage off kind of pseudo 1 card because you draw a card, is just really efficient and better than Iyslander can usually do, and is really nice in kind of any matchup where you want to sort of race and trade damage. Enlightened Strike helps keep those life totals close by just being a little bit more efficient than what Iyslander usually gets to be. And a lot of decks typically are bringing in Arcane Barriers, so they don't really have armor for these attacks, and we really get some extra efficiency out of these attacks in those matchups. Next, we have our defensive cards, Oasis, Sink Belows, 1 Fate Foreseen, and 2 Sigil of Solace. These help us play long games into Guardian and can sometimes help us block versus decks like Doranthia. We also sometimes board in just a few D-Reacts or like a couple Oasis against some of the Rune Blades to help us play defense a little bit, since we do start the game with 36 life. So this is our defensive suite. And then finally, we have blues. The core of the deck plays 34 blues. Typically, I board up to about 38 or 41 blues, depending on the matchup, so I'll bring in some of these. These blues are more setup-based. Energy Potions and Amulet help us set up and do our combo game plan. Strategic Planning is mostly here as a potential 4th Ice Eternal, since we don't have Eisenhower Weather Vane or Sigil of Permafrost as an extra win condition. Sometimes in the very long games, this can buy back another Ice Eternal and just help us close out the game, and it's a pretty low-cost way to do that. Finally, we have Hypothermia for a lot of aggressive strategies, and it's also good into Dromai as it stops our dragons. Notably, this card will stop Go Again if it's a card that doesn't naturally have it. So even if the card already has Go Again, it will actually remove Go Again from that card. And then we have Channel Bleak Expanse, just as a little bit of tech into a Belittle Briar deck, and has some legs in the FaB matchup as well. Just keep in mind Channel Bleak's effect is symmetrical, and it can shut down some of the card draw that you want to do, such as Sink Below and Enlightened Strike, and it can turn off your fuse. So be a little bit selective and careful about when you play it, because sometimes it can give you problems. So keep that in mind. So this is more or less the sideboard cards that we use, and then we'll go into a couple specific sideboard packages that we use for some of the common matchups that you might see in this classic constructed metagame. So first off, when we're playing against Oldhim, this is the set of cards that I like to bring in. We have our defensive package here to help play the long game. We really are trying to set up 3 Frost Hexes, 3 Insidious Chills, and go all in with Ice Eternal and do a huge chunks of damage, maybe over the course of 1 or 2 turns, where we take their whole hand and force through a whole bunch of damage. We have a variety of D-Reacts here. So the Sigil of Solace is specifically for Oldhim. It gets around Heart of Ice and helps with Dominate. Sinks and Fates can help deal with things like Tear Asunder or Oakenold, and so can Oasis Respite, while also getting around D-Reacts. Getting around Dominate. The reason that we play a variety of these is that they're good in different matchups, and they also help our opponents not know exactly what we have left in our deck. For example, if we play 2 Sigil of Solace, they have to wonder about if there's a third one. Once they see 1 Fate Foreseen, they have to wonder about if there's additional Fate Foreseens. So the idea here between splitting it up is making the deck slightly less predictable for our opponent if they're tracking what's in our deck. And you can kind of play around this and keep your opponent guessing by playing a mix of these, but I found about 8 to be right. Some players like 9, but I kind of like the 8. I think that's enough. We also have some poke for Oldhim. We find it's important to be able to push through damage and force them to block sometimes, just so that you're not always on the back foot. They can hurt quite a bit. And then we have some blues to round out. So these are kind of our setup blues. The extra amulet, the energy potions can let us Ice Eternal for just a bit more. And then the 4th Ice Eternal, like I mentioned, from the strategic planning. So in the Oldhim matchup, we're really trying to preserve life, set up, and then find that combo turn to close out the game. This matchup usually goes to 2nd or 3rd cycle and can be quite lengthy, so you need some practice to make sure that you can get there and not worry too much about the clock. The next matchup we're going to look at here is Briar. Into Briar, we do want to keep the life totals by racing, so we bring in some damage spells, damaging attacks like Command and Conquer, which can take their arsenal, especially when they don't have Crown of Providence, and Enlightened Strike, which keeps the life totals close. Freezing Point is chosen over Ice Bolt because it's an extra way to activate your amulets in Insidious. And we bring in some extra blues in strategic planning and these cards, the 3 Hypothermia and the 2 Channel Bleaks, because they just allow us to fuse more consistently, and Channel Bleak is a really potent tool against Belittle should they be running it. I do like the Sink Below since it helps block things like Snatch and some of the other 7 breakpoints that they might have with some on-hits. However, I don't like overloading too much on these because we do want to keep the life totals close and we do want to trade. Sometimes giving them too much space and too much time to set up can just give you more time to whiff. Usually you want to kill them before you run out of premium disruption like Hypothermia and like Channel Lake Frigid. So that's the Briar matchup. Next we have Viserai. This board is similar to Briar, extra blues to allow us to fuse, and we want even more blues against Viserai just because we often want to be able to stop Arcane. Arsenaling is 0 so we can get value off of Alluvian Constellas, which we sideboard in as our extra Arcane Barrier is really helpful. And then we want these disruptive 6 power attacks and more fuses for our Insidiouses. Usually chaining discard and really just disrupting as much as possible while preserving our life total is really important. And if you're taking damage, you either want it to be to set up an Insidious or to do some kind of disruption like a Command and Conquer or Erase Face. You don't really want to be coming in with just raw damage unless it's just relatively free to do so, because they often have off turns and we can play towards those. Sync and Oasis Respites help us deal with some of the 7 breakpoints like Shrills with Mauve Skies that we can't really afford to let hit. And Oasis is particularly good in this matchup because they are almost always dealing Arcane, and it's easy for us to get the 1 pitch, and the life gain can matter quite a bit. Keep in mind this can also stop a Rosetta Thorn all by itself, so it's quite good in this matchup. The cards I have here are for the dash matchup. The idea here is that we really need to push damage, so we want as much poke as we can with Ice Bolt and Freezing Point, and Enlightened Strike also helps us push damage. We can do something like Go Again into Ice Bolt. We do need to kill them before they set up their items. So we either want to be pushing lots of damage or taking the time to set up Frost Hexes and Insidious Chills. Erase Face is nice because it turns off Boost in the later turns, and it also can turn off the Mechanologist Pistols. They can't get Go Again from the Induction Chamber. Hypothermia also stops their turns, and then Channel Bleak is here as a potential way to stop Spark of Genius. But really, we do want to be setting up our Frost Hexes and comboing them out while trying to make sure we don't die, with Hypothermia and Channel Lake being key ways to stop some of those late game pistol turns. All right, that's going to conclude this deck tech. Thanks for watching, and good luck at your nationals.